Hi, welcome back, everybody. As usual, I hope you had a great week. I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. My mom passed away 9 years ago. My grandmother passed away in 2014, and my great grandmother passed away in 2001. And I miss them terribly, and I wish they were still here. I want to wish a happy Mother's Day to my beautiful wife. Without her, I don't know where and what I would end up doing. I also want to wish a happy Mother's Day and continue to pray for my mother-in-law Peggy, who is currently in the hospital right now dealing with some severe medical issues, and ask that y'all do the same thing. Please pray for me and my family in this time. In the last week or so, we've had some serious things happen, and could really use all the prayers and positive vibes you guys can give. Hope you're ready for our next video. Got my notes a little bit more organized this time around, so I'm not throwing pages everywhere. Like I said, I want to clear something up from last week. I mislabeled last week's video. That was Article 1, Sections 1 through 6, not 1 through 7. Section 7 will be discussed today. But I felt like that certain things in Section 7 needed to be discussed with the powers of Congress, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that being said, let's jump right on into it. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. This part of the Constitution is also another aspect derived from the British Parliament. It pretty much ensures that bills that raise taxes or other sorts of revenue of any kind are originated in the House that is directly accountable to the people. In Britain, that's the House of Commons. That chamber is accountable to the people. The people elect those members. This came about as a part of the Great Compromise that resulted in Congress having two chambers. The states with larger population were, they were butthurt that there was some sort of seemingly lopsided power given to the smaller states in regards to the Senate. So this clause was to theoretically offset that, clear that up. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it, but if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceed to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of that House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent together with the objections to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered. And if approved by 2/3 of that House, it shall become a law. But in all cases, the votes of both Houses shall be determined by yeas and nays, and the names of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered on the journal of each House respectively. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted, after it shall be presented to him, the same shall be law, in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. This clause lays out the process of how laws are passed. Bills have to be approved by both houses of Congress, as we all know, by a majority vote, and then it's sent to the President for a signature. If the President approves, he sends the bill, or if the President disapproves, he sends the bill along with his objections to the bill back to the chamber it originated from. For instance, if it was a tax bill, then he sends it back to the House of Representatives. This is called a veto, and we have all been hearing a lot about vetoes within recent decades, about how a president's going to veto a bill or whatever, and it becomes a big topic in the media and everything. So if the president vetoes a bill, then they have to reconsider it. And if 2/3 of both houses agree to pass the bill again, then the veto is overridden and it becomes a law. The president has 10 days, without Sundays included, to return a vetoed bill to Congress. And if he does not, then it's a law. But if Congress adjourns their session before this 10-day window is up, then the bill is dead, and that's what's known as a pocket veto, and you can't override those. And there have been several instances of pocket vetoes over the course of history. Presidents have deliberately done this because they know when Congress plans on adjourning, and they know that the 10-day window is going to expire, and so they wait and wait and wait. They don't do any action on the bill. It's kind of it's a tactic some presidents use to make Congress look like the bad guy, instead of Congress saying, well, we passed this bill, it's a great bill, but there's all kinds of garbage in it, and the president vetoes it because of all the garbage in it, and the president looks like a bad guy. It's a back and forth bunch of bullshit. But there's little tricks in there that both sides can have against each other, and so pocket vetoes are one of them. We'll talk about more about vetoes here in just a minute. Every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and the House of Representatives may be necessary, except on a question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States, and before the same shall take effect, shall be approved by him, or being disapproved by him, shall be repassed by a 2/3 vote of the Senate and House of Representatives, according to the rules and limitations prescribed as in the case of a law. This clause states that anything going through Congress has to be, or except congressional adjournment, has to go to the president and follow the same procedure as a bill becoming a law. And that's important because it ensures that Congress can't do anything unilaterally, just like the president can. Back in 1996, I'm sure you remember during Bill Clinton's term in 94, the Republicans took over both houses of Congress, and in 96 Congress passed the Line Item Veto Act, which gave the president power to strike down certain parts of a bill and send those parts back to Congress for reconsideration while the remainder became a law. And that was hailed, everybody loves that. That's a great idea. Regardless of who's the president, that's a great freaking idea. Clinton versus City of New York resulted in the Supreme Court striking down line item veto as unconstitutional because it supposedly granted legislative power to the president by giving him the ability to amend laws. And I find that disgusting on the part of the Supreme Court because it might give the president legislative powers. I mean, that's an argument that can be gone either way, but so much junk comes through Congress, and if there's not a way to filter some of that mess out, then it gets attached to a law that's a good law, that's something that we need, and if the president was to veto that, then he's going to get crucified. He or she or whoever the president is going to get crucified because some idiot attached an amendment to a bill, and it's a crap amendment, but it's not going to make it through Congress on its own, and they know that, and that's why they do that stuff. And that's why I think line item veto is a necessity. However, passing the Line Item Veto Act, I think, was a mistake. It should have been a constitutional amendment. If one goes back and looks at the Confederate Constitution, there's very little difference in the Confederate Constitution and the United States Constitution. But one of the many differences is that the Confederate Constitution gave the president line item veto. And that's a great idea. I'm for line item veto 100%. Some presidents have used their veto power quite extensively. Andrew Johnson did in the post-Civil War days during Reconstruction when the Congress was trying to punish the South for the war. Johnson vetoed a lot of stuff that he didn't think was fair. Johnson was a unionist. He was somebody who loved the Union, but he did not think that harsh punishment should be done to the Southerners, and so he vetoed a lot of stuff. And his nickname actually was Sir Veto. Some presidents haven't even vetoed stuff at all. Matter of fact, 7 of the 44 people who have been president have never vetoed a single bill. Not one. And that's saying something, you know. Throughout history, there have been over 2,500 vetoes, to include pocket vetoes. And so if you divide that by, let's see, 44 from 7 from 44 is 37. So if you divide 2,500 vetoes by 37, you know, you got a lot. And so now this is where we get into the real meat and potatoes of congressional power and restrictions. This is Section 8, and these next 3 sections specify powers and restrictions granted to Congress and in specific restrictions on powers of the states. But we're going to start with Section 8, which gives the specific things that Congress can and can't do. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. That first clause, we're going clause by clause because it goes all the way down in specific specific sentences and stuff, specific clauses for each power. This clause gives Congress the power to tax and spend for the common defense and general welfare of the country. One of the biggest complaints that our forefathers had about the Articles of Confederation was Congress's gross lack of power to lay and collect taxes. Instead, Congress was forced to rely on each state to give them requisitions, and that lack of power really left Congress kind of impotent and vulnerable. I mean, it was at the mercy of the states. The states didn't really want to give up too much sovereignty, and they were worried about that. And so, you know, some states paid only part of what Congress requested, and some simply just said, "Screw you, horsefly, we aren't going to give you anything." You know, and without the appropriate revenue to enforce laws and treaties and pay the debts, and without any sort of power to compel the states to give them the money that they needed to comply with the rule, you know, the Confederation just wasn't worth anything. I mean, it was in danger of collapse, and that became a problem. And now in recent years, Congress has used the power of taxation for uses other than raising revenue. Certain examples include taxation to regulate commerce, taxing to discourage, suppress, or exterminate commerce, and the obligatory taxation such as the Affordable Care Act, which imposes a tax for those who do not purchase health insurance. The last 2 examples are really argued by many to be unconstitutional, and I'm in agreement with that opinion. And uniform throughout the United States, okay. Direct taxes, as it says in previous clauses in one of our previous videos that we discussed, must be appropriated by population. That tax, as the Affordable Care Act calls it, is a direct tax, not one of these kind. Therefore, it violates the Constitution. Period. And we'll get to other parts of the Affordable Care Act, and I say that term loosely. But we'll get to that later on in other sections of this video. With the power to tax, Congress has the implicit power to spend the revenues raised in order to meet their objectives and certain goals that the government has. And you know, it's there's a lot of debate, I mean, an argument regarding to what extent Congress has these powers. You know, and that's been going on ever since the Constitution went into effect. So it's still argued to this day how what the extent of that power is. Of all the limitations on the power to tax and spend, the General Welfare Clause has received the most notoriety, and it's one of the most hotly disputed, and it's one that I'm going to discuss a little bit here because I want to clear some things up. General welfare does not mean what you think it means. Okay? James Madison, the man who is called the father of the Constitution, and the reason he's called the father of the Constitution is because the son of a bitch wrote most of it. Okay? So he would know it better than anybody else. So Madison wrote in, and I forget which one of the Federalist Papers it was. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I forgot to write it down. He wrote in the Federalist Papers, and he also advocated this at the Virginia Ratification Convention, that the clause is only for spending that is directly tied to the specifically enumerated powers of Congress. And it's not a specific grant of power, but a statement of the purpose of the power to tax. Madison was the one who gave the General Welfare Clause. He didn't really think that it was a power of Congress. It was Congress has the power to spend this money, but it's only for using for these powers that you're given. It's not for doing willy-nilly. Now, Alexander Hamilton wrote an opinion, or argued for an opinion, but it was only after the Constitution was approved and went into effect. He argued for a broader interpretation. Hamilton's interpretation has had the most influence, and I believe this to be the incorrect interpretation. I'm going with Madison because, you know, Madison knows more. He wrote most of the Constitution, so, you know, I'm going with him. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story. Now, I know I spoke about him in a previous video, but Story, he wrote a paper called Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, and in his writing, he used the Federalist Papers heavily. He relied a lot on the Federalist Papers, and Madison wrote quite a few of those. I think Madison wrote the most of those as well. But in that particular writing, Story advocated Madison's view and explained that Hamilton's was rejected at the convention, and so that's what general welfare means. General welfare applies to the specific powers granted in the Constitution and not any damn thing you want. So, the next clause, to borrow money on the credit of the United States. And this power is what has led to the incredible rise of our national debt over the course of history. I am of the belief that the lack of constraints on this power is the reason for our national debt being out of control the way it is. There really needs to be some amendments to the Constitution, or at least one amendment to the Constitution that addresses this. And, sort of like the balanced budget amendment. You have to pass a balanced budget. And I'm for a balanced budget amendment, all the way. This clause needs to be elaborated on considerably more than what it has been. I'm not knocking our founding fathers, but the men were geniuses, but I think that everybody makes a mistake. There was only one perfect one, and they killed him. And I think this is one of the mistakes that was made, is this particular clause. Next clause, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Commerce clause. Regulate commerce. Regulate. That's where the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional once again. The Affordable Care Act imposes interstate commerce. It is forcing you to buy something you either do not want or do not need. That's not regulation. That's imposition. That's forcing you. That's a violation. Congress has the power has regulatory power over national commerce, both internally and externally, and some courts and congressional commentators consider the clause as three separate powers. Internationally, states, and Native American tribes. And there's considerable dispute existing within the courts as to how wide the range of powers granted by Congress is to this. And that's where the Affordable Care Act falls into this. It's often paired with the Necessary and Proper Clause, and we'll discuss that later. And the combination of the two clauses are used to take a broad and expansive perspective of Congress's powers. Some would say too broad and too expansive, and I would agree with that. In any event, the effect of the Commerce Clause greatly depended on the ranging of the interpretation of the Supreme Court over the years. During the Marshall Court, John Marshall, which was 1801 to 1835, interpretations from the Marshall Court empowered Congress to gain jurisdiction over numerous aspects of intrastate and interstate commerce, as well as non-commerce. And this expanded during FDR's presidency and post-World War II. Congressional use of the Commerce Clause became pretty much unlimited. Federal control over economic matters was just as sure as the sun rose in the east and set in the west. But however, since I'm going to say Rehnquist Court, because William Rehnquist was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for quite a number of years, since 1986. But I'm going to say 1986 to the present. Ever since then, the last half of that, Congress is starting to get more restrictive on the use of the power, and the courts are doing a good job at that, I think. The Commerce Clause is a source of the failed war on drugs, because we know the war on drugs has been nothing but an abject failure. It's cost lives, time, money that we hadn't needed. And it's also the source of drug prohibition laws under the Controlled Substances Act. For instance, in a recent medical marijuana case, Gonzalez versus Rich, the Supreme Court rejected the argument that the federal ban on growing medical cannabis for personal use exceeded congressional power under the Commerce Clause. Now that's ridiculous. The court ruled that even if no goods were sold or transported across state lines, there could still be an indirect effect on interstate commerce because this guy's growing his own weed. What fucking sense does that make? That doesn't make any sense. It's a horrible ruling in my view, and one that should be overturned. But in this case, the court relied heavily on a New Deal era case, Wickard versus Filburn, which held that the government can regulate personal cultivation and consumption of crops because of the aggregate effect of individual consumption, because of the effect that it could have on interstate commerce, and it would be an indirect effect. Because you're growing your own stuff at the house, you're not going out to the store and buying stuff, that affects commerce. No, it means you're smart. Next clause. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 establishes the uniform rules of naturalization and immigration according to this clause. The requirements became more explicit since the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which we'll discuss later on, and there have been a few recent changes made by the Congress in 2001. Congress has exercised power over bankruptcy laws several times, referring to the latter half of this clause. Several times since 1801, including through adoption of the Bankruptcy Reform Act of '78 and the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. Next clause, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. This clause is pretty much self-explanatory, and I ain't going to really go into a whole lot of detail on it except to say that unrestricted coining and regulation of the value of the U.S. dollar is another reason our financial system is in the toilet. There is nothing to back up the United States dollar in the Treasury. Nothing. Except the word of the federal government, which is absolutely worthless at this point. There's no gold, there's no silver, nothing. Back in these times, they were dependent on gold and silver because you had something physical and of value that would back up money. There's nothing now. Nothing. And I think taking us off the gold standard and taking us off the silver standard was a huge mistake. Next clause, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Another self-explanatory clause. Don't you wish the whole thing was this easy? I do. That way I wouldn't have to sit here and make these videos. It would be simple for the idiots out there who still think that there's stuff in the Constitution that there's not. Let's see. Next clause, to establish post offices and post roads. This clause was added to the Constitution to facilitate interstate communication as well as create a source of revenue for the United States in the early years. Earlier on, there were some disagreements as to the boundaries of the postal power. John Jay, who was our first Chief Justice, in a letter to George Washington, was of the opinion that the Postal Service should not be burdened with the responsibility of handling newspaper deliveries, which at early points they were, and also suggested that the post office be placed under the supervision of the executive branch. A great suggestion, which later led to the creation of the Post Office Department, which was a cabinet-level office for a period of time. And it's also the only executive department that the Constitution gives the Congress the power to create. It names it. It's the only one that's named that's created. Thomas Jefferson, my idol, my muse, my inspiration, love Thomas Jefferson. He feared that the Postal Service would become a source of patronage and a great waste of money. He also expressed doubt at granting Congress power to designate post roads, as he considered building of roads to be a state responsibility, which I agree it is a state responsibility. But Jefferson eventually was proven wrong about the waste of money, post office being a waste of money. But over in certain times it has been a source of patronage, and but that's changed in recent years. The post office is completely independent, and it is under the regulation of the executive branch, but it is an independent branch, and there's not really a whole lot of issues as with the post office right now. The next clause, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Copyright clause. This clause is the basis of intellectual property laws in the United States, specifically copyright and patent laws. You see musicians who got, for instance, a few years ago, the Napster case led by Lars Ulrich of Metallica. There was worries that was violating Metallica's copyright over their music. So there's a lot of instances you could go into. I mean, we could go into that, but why? I mean, we all have enough sense to realize what that's all about. Next clause, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Bingo. Congress has the power to establish lower level courts in our country, and the only thing the Constitution establishes for our judicial branch is the Supreme Court, and Congress was left with the power to establish the remainder of the judicial branch, the district courts, the federal level. The state level is completely different. State to state, it's different. It's different, but it's the same. I mean, they pretty much use the same model. But Congress was left to establish the remainder of the federal courts, the appellate courts, and then the Supreme Court is your last level. Period. After the Supreme Court, you're over and done with, buddy. Next clause. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Congress, basically, according to this, has the power to define what is a crime and how to punish these crimes in international waters, and also crimes that violate international law. And they have, at certain points, gone a little too far with it, but I think for the most part this has been decently held up. Now here's a big one. Next clause. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules rules concerning captures on land and water. Congress has the sole power to declare war, not the president. The clause, however, does not provide any specific format as to what form legislation must have in order to be considered a formal declaration of war, nor does the Constitution use this particular term. This is going to piss you off. The last time the United States formally declared war using the proper procedure for declaring war, Congress passes a declaration of war. Last time it was done on any country was in 1942, when war was declared against Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, who were allied with the Axis powers in World War II. Because Roosevelt, who did a lot of bad stuff, but this is one thing that he did right. FDR thought it would be improper to engage in hostilities against a country without a formal declaration of war. A position like I said, that I strongly agree with, and one that should be more adhered to. Since 1942, every single American president has used military force without a formal declaration of war. Korea was not declared. Vietnam was not declared. Gulf was not declared. I can keep going on and on. Bosnia wasn't declared. Our presidents since 1942, 77 years worth of presidents, have abused the Constitution and the War Powers Act. So let's move on before I get a little bit too pissed off. A letter of marque and reprisal was a government license in the age of sail, sailing, that authorized a private person, a privateer, or another word is corsair, to attack and capture vessels of a country who was at war with the country who issued the letter of marque and reprisal. Once captured, the privateer could then bring the case of the prize before their own admiralty court for condemnation and transfer of ownership to the privateer. A letter of marque and reprisal would also include permission to cross international borders to effect a reprisal or take action against an attack or an injury. And the privateers were also authorized by an issuing jurisdiction to conduct reprisal operations outside war. That's just, a lot of people don't understand what letters of marque and reprisal are, and that's what all that's about. The next clause says to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Congress is required to raise and support the United States Army and other branches of the military, but they cannot use funding for that purpose. The funding for that purpose has to be reissued every 2 years. To provide and maintain a navy, no explanation necessary. To make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. Uniform Code of Military Justice is where it comes from this. It's pretty much the foundation of military law in the United States. That Congress was the one who came up with the Uniform Code, UCOJ, MJ. Sorry, my brain is kind of on one track here. It's not programmed right now to focus on acronyms. It's programmed on this right now. Our next clause. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The Insurrection Act of 1807 governs the ability of the President of the United States to deploy military troops or state militias within the United States to put down lawlessness, insurrections, and rebellions. The general purpose here is to limit presidential power, relying on state and local governments for initial response in the event of an insurrection. Pretty much the state governor will call upon the state militia, and only if it's necessary the president can jump in and say, hey, we need these guys, we need all of you to come in and jump in and help out here. Coupled with the Posse Comitatus Act, presidential powers for domestic law enforcement are limited and delayed. That basically ensures that the military will not be used as a police force. Posse Comitatus. Next clause, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, very important, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, the word militia is defined as a citizen army. A citizen army. That means you and me, ladies and gentlemen. You and me. We are the militia. Congress is obligated under this clause to provide for organization, equipping, They have to provide for us being allowed to have weapons, and they have to provide for our proper training for these citizen armies. So if you decide you want to go out and join a militia, Congress has to provide for this. They are required by law, by the Constitution. Liberal heads explode in 3, 2, 1. Thank you for the sound effect, my love. The states can determine who are officers and such in the militia. Our next clause, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may be by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the state shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Woo, that's a mouthful. Okay. The District of Columbia was created as a result of this, and an act was passed, D.C. Home Rule, which is the ability of the residents of the district to govern their own local affairs. Since 1973, Congress has allowed certain powers of government to be carried out locally by D.C. officials. However, Congress maintains power to overturn local laws and exercises greater oversight of the city than exists for any other U.S. state. Congress pretty much has full control over D.C., and they can step in and do whatever they want regarding government there. Basically, dictatorial district. That's what that means. The district's locally elected government, however, it exists at the pleasure of Congress, and Congress, they can abolish that at any point. They have no obligation, D.C. has no obligation to have any locally elected government, according to that clause. And here's our final clause. And to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. The necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause as some people call it, it's been one of the most debated parts of the Constitution as it relates to how expansive the powers in this clause are. The draft of the clause sparked some serious controversy during the Constitutional Convention, and the inclusion of the clause really became a focal point of criticism for those who opposed the Constitution back in those days. Anti-federalists who were they wanted more of a confederation type. They expressed concerns that the clause would grant the federal government boundless power, and the Federalists argued that the clause would only permit the execution of powers already granted by the Constitution. This falls in line with the General Welfare Clause, as we discussed earlier. Alexander Hamilton spoke vigorously for the Federalist opinion in Federalist number 33. At this point, James Madison concurred with Hamilton, arguing in Federalist number 44 that without the necessary and proper clause, the Constitution would be, quote, a dead letter. At Virginia's ratifying convention, Patrick Henry took the opposing view, fearing that the clause would lead to limitless federal power that would inevitably menace individual liberty. That was a quote from Patrick Henry. I think we can all agree that Hamilton and Madison had the right intentions and views, but Patrick Henry's fears have really been realized. The necessary and proper clause is only to be used to carry out specific powers given to Congress, and not to do whatever they damn well please. this clause, along with the commerce and general welfare clauses, have been interpreted so broadly over the years that to this day the federal government of the United States exercises many powers that are not expressly delegated by the Constitution. And that's a bad thing. It's time to get the government back in constraint and let them know what's up. Madison disagreed with this view and asserted that Congress has no powers that are not expressly granted in the Constitution. And here's an example. As president, Madison vetoed the Federal Public Works Bill of 1817, calling it unconstitutional because in his view the federal government was not granted power to build infrastructure. Let's sit and think on that one a little bit, shall we? Now, we're going to start Section 9, which is specific limitations on Congress. Let's see. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. This section was referring to slave importation and slave trade, and the clause forbade Congress from restricting it or abolishing it prior to 1808. However, Congress did and could oppose a tax of $10 for each slave imported. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. A writ of habeas corpus is nothing but a legal action against unlawful detainment that commands a law enforcement agency or other body that has a person in custody to have a court look into whether or not it's a legal detainment. And it's basically saying that they can't hold you against your will unless they have a legal basis to hold you. And unless in cases of rebellion or invasion, you can't suspend this. The court can order the detainee to be released if the reason for the detention is deemed unlawful or unjustified. And the Constitution further provides that the privilege can only be suspended in those cases of rebellion or invasion. In 1866, the Supreme Court ruled that suspension of habeas corpus during war was unlawful and unconstitutional, thereby condemning Lincoln's actions during the Civil War because he did suspend the writ of habeas corpus. But military tribunals did not apply to citizens in states that upheld the authority of the Constitution and where civilian courts were still in operation. Therefore, if you were in a state that did not secede from the Union and civilian courts were there, you know, it's a catch-22. I mean, you could still be tried in a civilian court. But Lincoln was wrong in suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Just so you guys know, Lincoln was not a fucking angel. Okay? No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. A bill of attainder is just a law by which a person is immediately convicted without a trial. That's it. And an ex post facto law is a law that applies retroactively. In other words, it punishes someone for an act that was only made criminal after it was committed. You can't do that. However, ex post facto laws do not apply in civil matters. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. This clause reiterates what I said earlier about taxation. You have to, that direct taxes have to be apportioned by state population, which is why Obamacare is illegal. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. That's self-explanatory. Like I said, don't you wish it all was this easy? No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. Congress is not allowed to give preferential treatment to any state over any of the other ones by regulations of commerce or taxes, and no ship can be compelled to enter ports in one state and pay the taxes there because they're higher or whatever, or cheaper. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. All funds belonging to the United States Treasury can't be withdrawn except according to law. Modern practice has that Congress will pass an annual budget, and the number of appropriations bills according, to law, authorizing the expenditure of public money. The Constitution also requires that Congress, you have to keep regular records of this and publish these records for public viewing. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any president, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. This clause prohibits Congress from granting anyone in the United States any title of nobility, and it also specifies that if you're a civil officer under the United States, you cannot accept any gift, payment, office, or title from any country or foreign ruler without congressional approval. However, a U.S. citizen can receive foreign office and titles before and after their period of public service, but during is no go. And now Section 10, which specifies limits on the powers of the states. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligations of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. In this clause, it pretty much says that the states are not allowed to exercise certain powers that are reserved for the federal government. They can't enter into any treaty, alliances, or confederations with foreign countries. Grant letters of marque and reprisal. We've discussed those earlier. They can't coin money or issue any bills of credit, such as paper money. No state can make anything but gold and silver coin as tender in payments of debts, which expressly forbids any state from making a tender in payment. Making a tender, which is authorizing something that may be offered in payment. You can't do that. Of any type, any form of money to meet any financial obligation, unless that form of money is in the form of gold and silver. And much of this clause is devoted to preventing states from using or creating any currency other than that created by Congress. That's the basis of that. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. States cannot, without congressional approval, tax any imports or exports except for what they need to meet their state inspection laws, which Congress can revise at any point, and all such monies, the net money, has to be given to the federal treasury instead of the state. And the last section, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Under this clause, states can't without congressional approval, keep troops or armies in times of peace. They can't make any agreements or contracts or compacts with any other states or any other foreign countries, or engage in war unless the state itself is actually invaded. States can organize and arm militias according to the disciplines prescribed in Congress that we discussed in Section 8. The idea of allowing Congress to have say over these agreements between states goes back to one of the numerous controversies that arose during the colonial period and carried over during the Articles of Confederation. States were arguing with each other over a lot of stuff. In the Treaty of 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War and gave us all that land from the Mississippi to the Appalachians, states were, there was only 13 states. They were claiming these areas. States like Virginia, Connecticut, New York, they were claiming those areas in what's now Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois. They were, and there was all sorts of disagreements. And that's what led to the Northwest Ordinance, which gave Congress ability to organize the territories that we receive as part of treaties. At first, that was not considered a power of the Constitution, but I think it was a good idea to allow it. It gave us the power to acquire new territory, which is why we have a country so expansive as we do today. But the point of that is that Congress took control over these agreements between states. The states gave up their claims and only allowed claims to the southern part of that territory from Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, which resulted in the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi and Alabama. Now, that takes care of Article 1. Once we finish the main text of the Constitution, we'll go into more details on certain areas that arise with the amendments. As usual, everyone's comments and discussion has been civil, and for that I thank you. I appreciate all comments. If you like this video, give me a like. I will be back with next week with Article 2, which discusses the executive branch. We're going to talk about how the president is elected, what powers he has and what he does not have. And I think this is very appropriate for this time period because we have some issues going on right now about President Trump, who is claiming executive privilege over the Mueller report, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to go into detail about it, and I hope my videos have been helpful to you guys. I really do. I want everyone to know what's in the Constitution, and I want everyone to know that, for the most part, our elected people have been lying to us. Not all of them, but for the most part, they've all been lying to us. There's things right here in the Constitution that they can and cannot do, and they're doing it anyway because we are ignorant of their powers and their restrictions, and we're ignorant of our powers. We have powers to do something about it, and we need to wake up and understand this. I'm not against our government, not at all. I just want them to act within the constraints that they've had imposed on them for the last 200 or so years. That's all I want. I know some people out there are anarchists, and I respect their opinions. And hi Sean Morley, Val Venus, professional wrestler. He's an anarchist. He's got some really great ideas, and I respect his views. I don't agree with all of them, but I do respect him, and I hope he respects what we got. I just want our government to act within the constraints that it's been given, and that's the whole purpose of these videos is to inform you guys. And I'm gonna go. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Happy Mother's Day to all of you. And peace.